Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode in the weekly nonprofit podcast series, People in Fundraising. Today is Tuesday, January 27th, 2026. I am so excited for my guest today to join us, Will Schrepferman, who, like millions of people on the East Coast, just went through a massive snowstorm. And thank you, Will, for making time today. I hope you didn't experience any delays with worker life with all the snow you got out there.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tim. I did wear different shoes walking to the office today than I am currently wearing. If that gives you any indication of what it's like outside, but happy to be here.
Wonderful. And before we get into you introducing yourself to our audience, I want to mention that the wonderful Jen Filla connected me to Will, and here we are today. I'm excited, Will, for you to share your career history and your company with us, the services, and if there's anything you want to share in terms of where people can find you and your company, please feel free to add that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very easy to find on the internet or on LinkedIn. I'm the only person with my name, so just look me up, and even if you spell it close, you'll probably find me. And then if you want to learn more about DonorAtlas, we're just donoratlas.com.
Great. Thank you. And you co-founded DonorAtlas. We'll get into that very soon in the program. I'm excited for you to talk to our audience about the origins, the services it provides. Before we get to that point, just if you can take a few minutes, Will, and please tell our audience how you entered the fundraising development profession, please.
Yeah, happy to. So I've actually been fundraising since I was 13 years old. Um, so I'm now 24, so I can say I've been fundraising for more than a decade. It makes me sound more impressive than I am. But the long story, short, basically, I had a chronic illness as a kid. So I went to like the Children's Hospital where I grew up in, the suburbs of Indianapolis. And, the pediatric infusion center is never a particularly pleasant place to go. And I was there very frequently with a lot of other patients, and I kind of decided one day, like, we should spruce this place up a little bit. I wish there was like a TV and an Xbox and games and books, and like it feels like there should be some stuff here.
Yeah.
Um, and then I, being like a pretty precocious 13-year-old, went and like walked my Boy Scout popcorn routes, like went to my parents' workplaces, like literally with an envelope, collecting cash around town. And then I showed up to one of my doctor's appointments with like $4,000 of cash in an envelope, and I handed it to them. And I think they were like equally impressed as and confused. So, long story short, they were able to furnish the place up, make it a little nicer. And I also learned that what I had just done was called fundraising. So that was my like entree as a kid. And then, throughout middle school, throughout high school, did a lot of, I was, in school, so it was part-time at the time. But, part-time work for different organizations, including like the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, back where I grew up, and then also a few like stints working for political campaigns and that kind of side of the fundraising world too. Um, and then yeah, wound up studying government and data science at Harvard, where I was always working like at or around, mission-driven organizations.
Oh, okay. You have had touch points in so many facets of our sector. Certainly the healthcare side. You just mentioned the data and the technology piece, um, the health causes. You mentioned a couple of them just now too. Obviously, you're in a higher education environment at Harvard. So really, and to have all of that in half of your lifetime is remarkable for someone like me to hear that. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I'm extremely lucky. I feel like I've been in like a blender of cool experiences for the past few years, and I'm really lucky and I've learned a lot.
Wonderful. Um, I just have a follow-up, and we talked about this before we started recording, that yes, we have a set sleet sheet of questions, slate of questions. We also have some follow-ups and pivots, and one of them for me is if you could just share with our audience, Will, as you got into your studies at Harvard and the technology side, the data side, did you consider other avenues with those studies, or was it always like I had such phenomenal and personally impactful experiences with the development realm with fundraising that I want to really just focus on what I'm learning and applying in my studies to what I've experienced as a human.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't know if I necessarily thought about it quite that way at the
Mm.
time. I think, just spending a lot of time like at or around different organizations, obviously spending a lot of time working with data and often fundraising data specifically. Like, I think I approached it more from a lens of like solving problems and like being
Oh,
interested in like, hey, these experiences I've had, like deduping records or going and making dossiers for like a very demanding boss or like going to do like deeper research on a prospect or something like that. You know, I had done that enough times that I was just very, very curious about other people's experience. And so I
okay.
would say like in the very, very early days of DonorAtlas before it was officially like a thing at all, which I actually kind of started working on it when I was still in school during my senior year. So it was
Oh,
a
wow.
lot of like speaking with people, like getting feedback, like incorporating that and kind of starting to work with the early versions of what would eventually become Donor Atlas. So I would say like, yeah, we started out from like, I had these problems, kind of validated that other people had had similar problems, kind of set out to solve them,
Mm.
not necessarily with like the goal of a company or like any necessarily like product or like we didn't really know the shape of what it would take when we started out, to be honest.
Oh, okay.
We're kind of making it up as we go along and having fun.
That's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. And that is a very nice tie-in to the second question. This month, January 2026, marks just 2 years since you co-founded Donor Atlas. You're the CEO of Donor Atlas. You talked a little bit there, Will, or shared a little bit with us about the origin story. I'm curious to learn more about how you and your partners developed it. Were there gaps or enhancements to fundraising technology that you were seeing and thought, hey, I've identified these areas for improvement. Because you mentioned just a moment ago, like looking at solutions. How can I give a solution to this? Anything along those lines come to mind as you were developing and launching Donor Atlas, please?
Totally. Yeah. The one problem that I definitely like gravitated towards early on was specifically around like prospect and donor research. So, starting out with like what is Donor Atlas today, right? Like it is the world's smartest donor research tool. That's how I like to describe it. It's basically as if we could pull data from the entire internet and every news article, every piece of social media, like every piece of digging you could feasibly find anywhere online, even in hard to get databases.
Mm.
We put together in one place that's really easy to navigate. Every single one of our facts or figures we're going to give is going to be cited and verified, which is something amazing you can do with the power of tech today. That was previously pretty difficult.
Mm.
And they're very, I would say, like relative to people who have looked deep into donor research in the past, which the audience here probably has. The other way I like to describe our data is as it's contextual, right? That's a big benefit of pulling information from the entire internet. It means like we're not just reliant on one data source from 10 years ago to tell us something about a donor or a prospect. We can really build these more holistic and contextual profiles. And that's basically what I had seen was missing when we started out, right? It was a lot of this time where you would spend like an hour or two, like going deep on a profile, or maybe like longer, and just
Right. Yeah.
completely like fallen down the rabbit hole, it felt like. And having that experience, and then like kind of by day or by night, and then by day, like having my studies where you were seeing LLMs come out and AI kind of revolutionized the way you could interact with data. It felt kind of night and day of like there's all this like manual, this banging your head at the wall kind of work. Whereas like the technology is getting to the point where you can make the busy work, you can automate that part away.
Yeah.
So I'd say, yeah, it started out from that like frustration and the vision kind of coalesced around that. And now, we're lucky to be in a place where we're worked with hundreds of clients, have built an awesome team here in New York City, and we feel like we're just getting started.
Oh, that's awesome. That is so great. I just have a question. I'm thinking about a couple of other guests that have been on the program and have um, fundraising technology software companies of their own. When you mentioned that, Donor Atlas can scour the internet, I'm imagining, you're pulling in data information really from around the world, and with that comes different languages. So does Donor Atlas translate languages if you find something that is in Farsi or Russian or Afrikaans or something like that, Spanish.
Yeah, I'd say a big benefit into clarification is we do only work with United States donors and
Okay.
organizations. So we have not
Uh-huh.
really run into that problem that frequently.
Okay.
Um, I honestly don't know the answer, and I'm sure it possibly could, but I don't I don't want to say one way or the other
Sure.
definitively. Yeah. I'd say like rather than I think like the language problem, it's kind of an interesting analogy is like translating different kinds of data together, if that makes sense
Okay.
where I think the hard part, we don't often find like a Spanish news source. Like that's relatively rare.
Hmm.
The thing we will find is more like disparate kinds of information. For example, like if you're looking into somebody, you may identify they have a bio page from their employer, and there's a news article from a few years ago, and there's a few annual reports or 990s or places where this is showing up. So it's more about like unifying those different data sources.
Right.
That's kind of the really, really challenging part about what we do, and the part where the systems we've built are uniquely, good and better than anything I've seen, in this
Awesome.
space before. So yeah.
That's exciting. I'm curious, you mentioned, Will, a few moments ago, just the clients you have, and without naming names, I'm curious if you could share, generally, are you seeing your clients come from the higher ed, the healthcare space in the US?
Yeah, we definitely do not see any particular like specific place where we're completely like tied down. That's honestly one of my favorite parts of fundraising is like how diverse the organizations that do it are. So we work with the entire spectrum of organizations that raise money, like you said, from higher ed to healthcare to more traditional nonprofits to foundations, even if you're other like technology companies and like there's every day I feel like I learn about a new type of organization that it turns out we're going to serve, which is exciting.
Yeah, terrific. This is another just kind of impromptu question. I'll be attending some conferences in prospect development later this year, perhaps NEDRA, which is in Providence, Rhode Island, at the end of April. Certainly the APRA International PD Conference in Chicago in August. And I know you've been on the ground, at conferences as well. Just curious, what the reception has been from people that you talk with, because I think a lot of prospect development people are eager to talk to companies like DonorAtlas. Sometimes we're not sure like what to ask, and we definitely want to have like a symbiotic relationship. You're on the ground, we're on the ground. You have a service that can really help us. So yeah, just curious, what questions you typically get from conference attendees and what you hear that may be of interest to our audience in those conversations.
Totally. I keep all the name tags from the conferences I go to on like a bulletin board in my office, and I think I've racked up like 2 dozen at this point, and a lot more to come this year. So yeah, like I said, we love being on the ground. I think that's just a value we have as a company is like we view ourselves as being extraordinarily good listeners. Like we want to, if I could spend all day just like talking to our users or prospective users, that's what I would spend my time doing. That's my favorite thing to do. And I feel like conferences kind of just condense that, where you can have 10 amazing conversations in 10 minutes. It's
Yeah.
exhausting, but in a good way. And kind of full circle too, because that's actually where we met Jen originally.
Oh, okay.
So at APRA PD, which was in Baltimore last year.
Yeah.
So met Jen, had a lovely conversation, and now she's become a lucky to count her hopefully as a friend, and hopefully she'd say the same, and a client, and really enjoyed working with her these past few months. In terms of the typical interactions we have with folks, I think one thing we very very much like to do at conferences is like there's no like, there's no Wizard of Oz like curtains or like magic or gimmicks. Like we take our computers out, we put up a monitor and a keyboard and a mouse, and it's right there. So we really, really, rather than trying to do like smoke and mirrors and like too much like pitching, like we
Yeah.
want people to see it, right? Like it's
Yeah.
right there. Fiddle around with it. We'll kind of give a little bit of a mini tour and ask us the questions you want. And the most common ones are going to be, along the lines of people are really curious how like peer organizations or organizations that are similar to them use it, right?
Mm.
Because I think a way that a university, like giant research university conducts prospect research is going to be very different than the way, a local animal shelter that raises like $1 million a year might be. You can have a different level of need depending on your organization's like set up. So I think people are very curious about that. People are also always very curious. Like, I think there's always a little bit of like, I take this as a compliment. There's sometimes a little bit of the backhanded like surprise that like we're so young and our team is so small, which
Oh,
is fun. Because we've had conferences where like we've been there with 5 or 6 people and we told that's our whole team. Like that's everybody
wow.
we
Okay.
have in the booth. So I think people are sometimes surprised, hopefully pleasantly, at
Yeah.
that. And yeah, lots of questions obviously about the specifics and the data and how different people use it and CRM integrations and all the stuff that you start to get into when you get into the weeds, the questions become endless, but we're happy to answer.
No, that's awesome. I applaud you. Just on that note about, having a young and a small team, I just feel like, writ large, that's a lot of ways how, these great companies throughout the American economic history develop. You have this wonderful idea that is going to be impactful, and that with the excitement, the eagerness of being young and wanting to make a difference, and then the future is limitless at that point. So that's really cool, and I admire you also because, like, just that entrepreneurial spirit is not in me. Um, and so I admire people like you who have this vision for how I can identify problems, I can work to develop solutions, and I can take it out into the public domain and connect with people, and hear more about what they're experiencing, and see how, in this case, DonorAtlas, your company, can benefit them. So that's really cool.
Yeah, I'd appreciate it. I think you're selling yourself short where being a podcast host is not necessarily dissimilar, where, you're getting the word out there, you're making a product, that people want, and it's the same skill of listening and asking good questions at the end of the day. So don't sell yourself short.
Thank you, Will. That's been the one of the challenges of my entire life is my self-deprecating humor and selling myself short. It all traces back to childhood, I'm sure, at some point. Um, I'm really curious with this next question. I'm curious about every question I ask my guests, but this one in particular, because I'm hoping that it gets to both the professional side of you as well as the outside of work domain for you. And that it gets again to that entrepreneurial spirit I just talked about. I'm curious, Will, what have you learned about yourself as a founder, co-founder, in this case of DonorAtlas? And we talked just a couple times about, again, developing the idea, taking it out, refining it, connecting with people. In what ways may you have changed both as a nonprofit leader and as a person, as a direct result of the DonorAtlas journey to this point?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I think a lot of the times, like earlier on in my life, especially when I was in high school or college, like, and also there's going to be a literal version of this too, but I felt like I was backstage a lot of the time.
Oh,
I did actually do like technical theater and like was like a backstage, like stagehand and lighting designer and sounding designer for like musicals and plays,
oh,
which I
wow.
loved. And that's kind of how I felt like fundraising could be, or being like at least the data fundraising person was at organizations is
Yes,
like you're behind the scenes. You're the one that's kind of like making sure the lights stay on and making sure everything is pretty and nice. And honestly, if you do your job well, nobody notices, right? People
that's
only notice
right.
when you do your job poorly. Um, and I'd say as I've transitioned into running the company, I've kind of stepped on stage to some extent a little bit and had to get comfortable doing that. And I've kind of realized I like it.
Oh,
I think that
good.
the biggest thing too is earlier on in college and even starting during house, a lot of my time was spent like actually designing and coding and like doing a lot of the work to like make the thing. But I think as we've grown the team out, as we started to have more clients and more exposure, I have had increasingly less time to do that. And I don't mind it. Like I think I really enjoy the aspect of being out there in the world. Like I love listening, I love meeting people, I love learning about
Yeah.
people and their problems and like different organizations and how different folks do things. Um, and that's becoming more joyful to me than like, spending 8 hours working on a data project, which, maybe someday when I get 8 hours free in a row, I'll get back to doing. But I don't know how far out that is.
Yeah. Wonderful. And I think just on that note about, getting out into the world, is there a conference or a region, a state you have not yet been to through the Donor Atlas perspective that you really would like to get to and just
Yeah,
see?
it's tough. I think I've been to 45 states last time I
Oh,
counted. So, and it also helps that during COVID, I took a cross country road trip, so that was helpful to check off a bunch.
that's awesome.
Um, I would say I would love to go to Hawaii. That's one of them.
Wow.
If
Yeah.
there, I believe there is like an AFP Hawaii chapter. So if
Yeah.
anybody from that chapter is listening and you have an event coming up, we would love to sponsor it. Please feel free to reach out. And I'm sure our team would not be sad to come out.
Oh, that's great. Um, this last question here, Will, and I so appreciate your time today. Um, Love to get your thoughts on this one and take as much time as you would like because we have the time. Um, there's certainly quite a bit of a mixture of both optimism and anxiety around artificial intelligence, AI generally. And both as a podcast host and in my world in prospect development, I hear a lot of questions and concerns about how AI will impact specifically the fundraising world. In your estimation, and drawing from your conversations and being at conferences and hearing presentations and participating in those, what would you say that practitioners need to know as this new technology continues to evolve, please?
Totally. And yeah, also speaking from the perspective of we use a lot of AI in the back end of what we do. DonorAtlas would not be possible to build to the level of accuracy and depth of the data that we have without artificial intelligence. It's an extremely, extremely powerful tool, but like any tool, it ought to be used wisely, right? There are good and bad applications of
Yeah.
this tool. I think in fundraising specifically, one of the reasons I also always gravitated towards fundraising, I think, despite being a little bit of like a data nerd in person, is fundraising always felt like, and I think still very much is something that is like human.
Mhm.
It's one of the most relationship driven jobs on the planet. Maybe like completely relationship driven. And then it's the things that go under the hood, like I was saying, kind of like behind the scenes that I feel like are exciting to automate. Because I don't know if anybody's really like ever excited to dedupe records or to like drag rows around to try to like assemble a dossier or different things like that, or to read the 17th news article that you're reading about a person to just try to extract like one more fact.
Yeah.
Like those are like the behind the scenes, the back office, like whatever you want to call them, tasks. Like the more we can automate those, the more time people have to do the inherently strategic human relationship interesting parts
Yeah.
of the job. So I would say like again, for our work, that's pretty much all we do. But from a practical standpoint, something I'm always having very interesting conversations about is different ways that folks will use a lot. There's so many like free and out of the box and interesting tools, just beyond ChatGPT itself, like
Yeah.
Claude Code has been releasing a lot of products that you don't have to be a programmer to use in this
Wow.
past week, especially that I think are super interesting. But there's ways you can kind of use these tools like that boring thing that doesn't really require any kind of like human touch or taste or judgment or like relationship building.
Mhm.
That's the thing to automate so that you have more time to do the actual valuable work. So
Yeah.
I don't know, speaking with a lot of folks that have found interesting ways in their own like workflows or organizations to make the things that should be automated automated.
Yeah.
But I'm very wary, and this is something like we talk about a lot, like purely just like generative AI in fundraising, right? Like using AI to completely write fundraising copy that never gets reviewed by a human that just starts hitting people's inboxes. That's bad. And I also think donors, consumers, clients, members, constituents, whatever, can smell when something is inauthentic or like
Yes.
made with purely generative AI. So that's something we're very careful of on a product level too, is we won't use AI to like draft a email to a donor or
Mm.
to like suggest exactly the words you should say because those are the things that like I think our clients like fundraisers are great at, and those are the things we're not going to do pretty
Yes.
much ever, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, that makes sense. I agree with you. In my own experience, like every Monday I air these episode one episode in the podcast series, and I never use artificial intelligence of any sort to write my narrative, for good or for bad. I think I'm not a marketing expert, and I'm sure that if someone else were to see what I write as I'm introducing, Will's conversation in early March, for example, they may say, "Oh, Tim could have shortened this up, or he could have expanded." All well and good. I just feel like I would rather just use my authentic voice than run it through Chat GPT. I also know that that comes with, my own challenges of trying to set the table for the guest when I air these interviews. Um, and I'm also curious, Will, there's definitely the hands-on practical application as artificial intelligence services continue to change. I'm just wondering, as a thought leader, as a leader of the company, um, what sources do you go to for maybe scholarship on this or the theoreticals revolving around artificial intelligence? Are there particular news sources or publications, leaders that you look to for guidance or some inspiration?
Yeah. None in particular. I think the interesting thing about being a founder is having kind of a community of like similarly minded peers that are in completely different industries. But I think the interesting thing is a lot of again, the actual like foundational model work is being done by researchers and people who's I could never understand those papers, honestly. Like that's my co-founder is way better at that stuff. But I learn a lot from practitioners, just like looking at what other like especially early stage companies are doing, even in industries that aren't fundraising, is just fascinating.
Yeah,
I think that's kind of where a lot of the bleeding edge is being like, hey, what's this thing, this task, this workflow, this frustrating, obstacle that existed in the world that people just like for decades have thought, yep, that's the way it is. And
yeah,
then somebody comes along and is like, no, we could actually make this way better. I think there's a lot of folks for whether it's like have friends building compliance startups to like automate like HIPAA and SOC 2 and things like that just as an example. But I think they're, other looking at like early stage companies is always that's my favorite way to see this because it's just like you learn about problems you wouldn't have otherwise heard of.
yes,
Seeing the applications like kind of in practice as they hit industries is that's I don't know, that's interesting to me.
yeah.
So that's yeah, I would say maybe that's not a source people can go to. I wish there was like maybe there ought to be a newsletter about this or a news source where people compile this, but I haven't
Sure.
found it, I guess. Yeah,
You got enough on your plate, and
yeah.
yeah.
That's an idea for somebody else to take up. I
There
will not
you
I will not claim that one.
Well, there you go. Well, Will, thank you so much for your time. And I really appreciate, yes, we had these slate of questions, and I should say, and you did a great job going through the questions ahead of time and your responses today. I also really appreciate that your responses led to a lot of impromptu follow-up questions. And I just think that's a great human element part of this conversation that's like, oh, he mentioned this. Let's follow up on that. So I just appreciate you rolling with unscripted questions and thinking on the spot and sharing some really exciting thoughts and developments and talking about DonorAtlas today. So I really was excited to have you on. Thank you for being a guest today.
Yeah, thank you for a wonderful conversation.
My pleasure. For our audience, you'll be able to find Will's conversation on the various channels you've grown accustomed to hearing or watching these conversations. Will's conversation will air in early March of 2026 on YouTube, Podbean for people that listen to these podcasts. And thanks to my 100th guest, Luis Diaz of WISE and the Donor Participation Project for his sponsorship. Will's interview will be on my website, peopleinfundraising.wordifysites.com. And Will, thank you again for your time. I hope that our paths cross in real life at any of those conferences I mentioned and perhaps others this year and next.
Totally. I feel like the odds are good they will.
Yes, absolutely. Well, until then, be well and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Tim.